Today I'm going to be doing a real-world review of the Sigma 150-600 Contemporary lens. A few months back, after some exhaustive specking, testing and shopping, I eventually purchased this lens. I made a test video of some of the footage taken from this lens. Since that video came out, I got asked quite a few questions.
How good is this lens? Can I take videos and pictures using this lens? Is the Sigma lens a sharp lens? Is it really worth buying the Sigma lens? What is the quality of the Sigma lens? I have an APS-C camera. Is this lens worth it? Hey, show us your gear.
Wait, what? Okay, anyway, here's my experience using this lens. This review is not a comparison review, rather an in-the-field real-world test. For the price, as far as 600mm lenses go, there really wasn't anything close to it to compare to it. The Tamron G2 and sports versions of this Sigma lens at the time were also available, but they were filled with the rarest substances called unobtainium. My budget was under $1,000, and those lenses could only be found for double that price. So, comparing it to a $20,000 Canon 600 f4L series lens really doesn't serve any purpose. This is about as useful as that proverbial bull with tits. Although this lens may surprise you with its quality and optics, if you really had the money for a Canon L series lens, you would probably end up buying that lens. This lens is more aimed at the amateur photographer and non-professional video maker such as myself. Most people looking for this class of lens could never justify the purchase of a flagship glass from any of the main manufacturers. This lens comes in various mounts to fit other camera bodies from other manufacturers. I, however, only tested this lens on the Canon system. If your camera isn't a Canon, firstly, shame on you, but ultimately, sure, it will work all just the same. Where possible, all the footage that was taken for this video was done in 4K on the Canon 90D. We strapped this lens onto a Canon 550D to compare what it would be like against the Canon 90D with its 32 megapixel sensor opposed to the Canon 550D with its 18 megapixel sensor. This was more done just to justify the purchase of a Canon 90D, but anywho. This lens being a third-party lens, there's always the risk that they may have issues with its autofocus system. In our initial testing of this lens, it would appear that the 90D was having a few issues focusing on a subject or releasing from a subject. On the 90D it would hunt for its subject and generally wouldn't lock on as quickly as what it would on the 550D. Despite the 90D having a much better autofocus system, we were not able to achieve the same results as what we were on the 550D. A whole day shooting was had, video and photos. After much soul-searching, hitting my head on the desk, crying, wailing, and general unhappiness, I realized that my apparent stupidity was to blame. When I bought the lens, I also bought the Sigma USB dock to update the custom settings on the lens. Custom button 1 had been set to slow smooth focus for video. This is great for video work where it allows the focus to remain as smooth as butter during its focus transitions. However, during photos you want the opposite effect. You want a fast, accurate lock for focus. Switching off the custom mode straight away solved the problem. I went back out the following day to go and retake all the photos that I had taken the day before, this time with almost 100% success. I guess the camera was asking for turbo mode and the lens was not about to give a single about what the camera was trying to achieve. Let's maybe not speak about this again. So it appears as a general rule, if the lens is left in its standard modes, it will work perfectly with the camera that you're trying to use it on. On the whole, the focus is however generally very good. The lens is noticeably faster at 150mm than it is at 600, which is understandable, but it never feels unresponsive as other lenses we have used in the past. Once the autofocus is locked onto a subject, it generally stays there, depending on the autofocus mode that you have set it in. In the field, we have the camera set to object detection. The camera does a pretty good job in maintaining focus on our set subject. The camera is however set to a mode whereby it stops hunting if it loses focus completely. This normally only happens when the lens is at full or infinite focus. To remedy this, the lens is set to manual focus override to allow me to simply refocus using the focus ring. This camera setting was mainly enabled due to my limited brain capacity. Often in the field you'll put the lens cap on with the camera still being on. This causes the lens to hunt like a T-Rex in a theme park. I would say focus is probably the most important part about this lens. With poor focus leads to poor image quality. Fully extended at 600mm, focus is normally spot on, even with small objects like birds. To fill the frame at 600mm on a bird, say a pigeon size, such as this, it will mean that the bird is probably roughly about 10 meters away. The lens does suffer from certain amounts of focus breathing, meaning that if it does hunt, recording at 600mm will be quite noticeable if the size of the subject continuously changes due to the focusing. This is generally not noticeable as the lens locks on and stays locked on. What I have found with animals and larger subjects, the usable footage distance can greatly be increased. Filming animals in a far off distance is generally not a problem. However, a small side note, if the distance is too far, with any long tele lens, you start getting thermal ghosting, especially as the ambient temperature rises. The general rule with in-game parks in Africa is the temperature is usually hotter than the surface of the sun, so this will limit the usable distance at which you will be able to film. Another note about the focus, if you are going to use this lens predominantly for photos, I would suggest getting the Sigma dock and spend the time to set up the lens to your camera, especially if you are finding that the lens is back or front focusing whilst using the optical viewfinder. Video and live shooting, however, is not affected as it uses the sensor to focus the lens. All being said, the focus of the lens is good enough to get the job done in almost all situations with decent accuracy and speed. Specifically for the video work we do, this lens autofocus works perfectly in tandem with the camera's dual pixel autofocus system. It does however struggle more in low light situations with its generally slow aperture. A simple tweak of the manual focus override generally gets the focus back on track. Moving on to quality and sharpness. This is where the Sigma in my view absolutely excels. In decent enough lighting, this lens will return phenomenal results. Stopping down to f8 on this APS-C camera seems to yield the best results across the entire zoom range. Colors are accurate, contrast is really good and sharpness is, well, sharp. There also isn't a huge amount of chromatic aberration even at 600mm, generally can be corrected in post-processing anyway. There is a slight pincushion effect at wide open apertures across the zoom range. This vignetting is less noticeable when at f8, and this too can be easily removed in post-processing. So far, with the thousands of photos taken and hours of videos filmed, the average zoom I have used is between 450 and 600mm for wildlife and birds. With this lens, as an amateur photographer and videographer, I will usually only use this whilst in a game reserve. Living 4 hours away from any said game reserve makes this lens not an everyday item in my camera bag, or so I thought. I have been using it quite extensively at kids' sports games and events. With its 600mm reach, you can get more candid, unobtrusive shots, be it people or wildlife. The bokeh on the lens is quite smooth and pleasing when the subject's background is sufficiently in the distance. With its narrow aperture range, close subjects may not have the same amount of separation as obviously an f4 or f2.8 lens, but this is one of the sacrifices you will have to make to get that 600mm reach. The image quality for its price is outstanding. The lens has a built-in optical stabilization system when using a Canon or Nikon mounts. As previously mentioned, the stabilizer has 3 modes: off, mode 1 and mode 2. The latter 2 modes have 3 different assignable settings each, which gives quite a few permutations when using the lens handheld or on a tripod. With the Sigma dock you can change these custom settings. However, in an out-the-box situation, mode C1 and C2 custom modes have been set to standard and moderate view respectively. A third setting can be set using the USB dock called dynamic view mode, but more about those settings in a moment. In mode 1, the optical stabilization allows for horizontal and vertical stabilization. The custom settings will then determine how much it needs to stabilize. Standard is kind of the Goldilocks mode, not too much, not too little. The moderate view mode offers a bit more active stabilization, but it tries really hard to keep the viewfinder steady during composition. The last setting, dynamic view mode, is basically the Freddy Krueger on setting. There's a lot of internal violence going on inside the lens, along with a very aggressive stabilization in the viewfinder mode. In this mode, when you click the shutter, the composition jumps around as if you had just told an Instagram influencer they were no longer getting free stuff. though this mode does offer the best stabilization system, with the sacrifice being some of the composition. All three modes do work quite well, especially handheld, whereby I've managed to take images at longer zoom ranges in lower than optimal light conditions. Mode 2 allows for horizontal panning, whilst only stabilizing in the vertical plane, or axis. You have the same custom settings available as with Mode 1. For video, however, this is where things tend to fall apart. When videoing, you're generally on a tripod and the optical stabilization is turned off. At zoom ranges greater than 400mm though, any slight movement or flexing of the tripod results in perceptible vibrations in your footage. Switching the optical stabilization on in standard or moderate settings helps a huge amount to get rid of the higher frequency jitters and smoothing the lower frequency ones to being almost imperceptible. This is where a major problem creeps in. Once the rig is completely stabilized in this mode and is 100% dead stable, the stabilizing motors then cause the image to float in a standard mode or jitter side to side in a moderate mode, as shown here. Whilst it's doing that, the motors do start to create a high-pitched whine, which is picked up by the microphone. The only way therefore is to get usable footage is to switch the optical stabilization system off. You will have to have the camera on a beanbag or tripod and hope the subject does not move, which requires panning. Any touching of the camera or the lens results in a high-frequency jitter on the footage. It was initially quite annoying, but I've just had to learn how to adapt to get around the issue whilst filming. You just have to keep remembering not to breathe anywhere near the lens for the duration of its recording, whilst at 600mm. The lens ergonomics are what you would expect from this class of lens. At 1.8 kilograms, it's not exactly light. After using it at a sports event for 2 hours, handheld, you will have the upper body look of Arnold Schwarzenegger, which I guess is an added bonus. Its mostly plastic construction and sort of weather-sealed gasket makes it fairly rugged, but you wouldn't want to be dropping it or wading through rivers with it. For most usage cases, its quality is good enough to be a long-term member in your camera gear. It comes with a front lens hood as well as a tripod collar, along with its own padded carry case. As for the tripod collar, it is extremely handy, especially for telephoto lenses, and sadly not a standard feature on all lenses in this price bracket. So, to sum it all up, I really do love this lens. Amateurs with a budget will definitely get the mileage out of it. Focus and quality are great and a huge step up from kit lenses such as the 70-300 or in Canon's specific case, the EFS 55-250mm lens. The build quality is good, not great, but for the price point it doesn't feel cheap. The optical stabilization system is great for photos in most conditions, but buyers beware for videos. This definitely can't be used as a handheld point-and-shoot video camera. On the whole, if I had the same budget and had to buy this lens again, I definitely would. Unfortunately, the biggest issue I have with this lens, oddly enough, is its 95mm front thread size. For video, I've generally found that I need ND filters. This is to lower the light, keeping a wider aperture and fixing the shutter speed. However, filters, polarizers and protectors for the 95mm thread are expensive. That is if you can even find them. And by expensive, we talk more than the grand national debt of a small African country. It's not a deal breaker, but it's more of an annoyance. So, if you're in the market for a super zoom lens, this could be the one for you. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe and ring the bell to get notifications from this channel.